Hi, I'm Peter Gavanna, and welcome back to our series on preaching an unknown God, looking carefully at Acts 17, verses 16 through to the end. We've been looking at Paul's strategy when he finds himself in Athens, in a place that wasn't associated with Judaism, certainly not with Christianity. And I've been suggesting that this is the case in many, many places today, especially, for example, in Great Britain. So we looked at Paul's attitude, that he saw himself as needing to be charming and complimentary and not to be offended by the culture. And then we've been looking at his bridge building exercises with them, if you like, his connection, the evangelist's connection. And we saw that although he preached the Bible 100%, he didn't quite tell them that's what he was doing. He didn't use any authoritative names or verses. He didn't say this is from Isaiah chapter 10, that kind of thing, but yet still preached the message of the Hebrew scriptures to them. Now, just to progress this a little more in this section, Paul does something absolutely extraordinary. Remember, we're talking about him building bridges and not creating barriers for his message. And as he comes to preach to them, he decides that he is going to quote some authoritative sources. He is going to use some direct quotations. But what he does is absolutely extraordinary. Look at it with me. Just picking up in verse 27, he's speaking at Mars Hill and he says, God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, although he is not far from each one of us. And then in verse 28, this quotation begins, for in him we live and move and have our being. As one of your own prophets have said, we are his offspring. Now, these are two quotations, not from the Old Testament, but in fact from two Greek poets, two Greek philosophers. The first, in him we live and move and have our being. Do you remember? If you go back a bit, you'll remember that was a Christian song. That quotation actually comes from Epimenides. Epimenides was a sort of I've called him a mythical prophet. We don't know exactly what he was, but a writer of Greek literature, but believed to be a prophet of the Greek god Zeus. So when he says, in him we live and move and have our being, Paul means in Christ or in the God of Israel, in the Bible God. But when Epimenides used that, he meant Zeus. In Zeus we live and move and have our being. Now this is incredible, but it doesn't seem to faze Paul at all. He doesn't seem to think this is the wrong thing to do or a bad use of a text. The second character cited here is Aratus. Again, a Greek poet, a 3rd century BC poet, writing in something called we would say today the phenomena, the appearances. And he writes these incredible words, for we are his offspring. Now, once again, Aratus is talking about Zeus, but Paul uses Aratus's words completely out of context, we might add, in order to build connections, build bridges with his audience. Now, what can we deduce or learn from this? Remember, we said that Luke was being prescriptive when writing Acts. In other words, trying to show us ways of doing it in the future or for today. Well, what we can learn is this. Of course, we are supposed to be Bible preachers. Of course, we should be people who open the Bible to preach, not popular culture. That doesn't have the answers at all. One person said there are two kinds of preachers: those who use the Bible and those who should resign. And that will be true almost all of the time, except perhaps one time, which is an occasion like we read here in Acts 17. Paul is wanting to build bridges with his audience. And so what he does, without endorsing Greek mythology, without preaching the Greek god Zeus, who of course he would have understood to have been no god at all, he takes some of their cultural literature, some of their cultural thinking, and preaches Jesus from it. In a way, he's already done that by looking at the altar of the unknown God and preaching Jesus Christ from that altar. He has seized hold of things that they value in their culture and in their thinking, and he has preached Jesus from it. So there may be occasions, and we should treat this with great care and with great thought, but there may be occasions when preaching the gospel to people who have never heard it before, have no biblical background whatsoever, when making connections to use our own culture's voices, our own cultural icons, things that maybe celebrities have said, or politicians, or preaching from current events, just to create connections. Now, please hear me carefully. This is not the gospel. You haven't preached the gospel because you've quoted Bono or some pop star or some actor. No. But it is a way to at least begin a conversation and at least to begin drawing people towards our gospel message. This is what Paul continues to do in greater or lesser degree in this whole message. He seizes hold of shared beliefs. We should probably think about the people that he was directly speaking to. Luke tells us that among that group prominently were the Epicureans and the Stoics. Now, these were two different schools of thought in Greek philosophy, but Paul is absolutely aware of this audience, and I can prove it. The Epicureans were an interesting group. They were quite a peaceful, tranquil, orientated group. They probably had great mental health, actually. They believed in pleasure, not so much sinful pleasure, but just keeping peaceful and keeping calm, being happy. For them, gods either didn't exist at all, or if they did exist, well, they were a long way away. They didn't get involved in human affairs. And so as a result of that, idolatry was strange to them. In fact, it was not part of their thinking. Even though they were Greeks, they weren't really big on idolatry. They thought perhaps that it was irrational. The second group that Paul is aware of are the Stoics. Now they're a little different. The Stoics had a view of God that was, how can I explain it? Well, I think of it as world soul. In other words, God was like in everything, a little bit like a Star Wars idea of God, that God existed in everything around us. He's in us all. He's in everything all. He's in us. He's in the trees. He's in the sky. He's like a sort of a giant force, a big spirit God. And they thought of humankind as being united, all sort of part of one family. Now, with that in mind, let me bring you back to those verses again. Can you see that what Paul preached was shared belief territory with them? It was something that they could all say amen to. The end of verse 24 and verse 25 particularly, God does not live in temples built by hands. He's not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Well, this is something that the Epicureans would have really, really clapped and said, amen to that. And then we get this second phrase, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. Well, that's something that the Stoics could have agreed on. So what can we learn from all of this? What's Luke's prescription for us? That when preaching an unknown God to a culture, to a generation that have never heard it before, and this, whether we're behind a pulpit, preaching in the centre of town, or like most folks, sharing their faith in a coffee shop with a friend, family member, or with someone at work. When doing that, we're going to say some extraordinary things. We're going to say some pretty out there things that if they come from a very secular mindset, it's going to be very challenging. So maybe it's best to start with shared beliefs, things that we can agree on. Because we're going to go on to challenge their view of the universe in a pretty out there way. I.e., before we potentially burn our bridges, let's build them well.